afternoon, everybody. I wanted to start by welcoming you all here today for our talk by Professor Layli Maparyan, which is on a womanist perspective on development. What I want to emphasize first is that this talk has really been made possible thanks to the US Embassy and their generosity, because Professor Maparyan is actually here to do a German tour in relation to Black History Month. And in fact, I'll do a little plug. And there is also this evening at the American Studies Department a talk at 6:15 on building cultures of inclusion across race, ethnicity, and religion. So really, on that note, I would really like to thank Dr. Uta Meyer for bringing Professor Maparyan to us safely, but also through yourself to thank your colleagues in the Berlin office, and especially Dr. Martina Cole on your behalf. Thank you. Aside from that, I thought I'll start with a little bit of bragging rights. I've had the pleasure of knowing Professor Maparyan since 2005, 2006. And it was quite by chance. I made an application to Georgia State University for the Women's Studies Department for a job. It was like, I've graduated, I need to find a job. Now, interestingly enough, I didn't get an interview for the job. About that. But I think in a sense, I gained much more than that. Because one of the things that occurred was that I was asked to contribute to a really important one-of-a-kind anthology, which was the Womanist Reader, really the first of its kind. But beyond that, I also had the opportunity to put a face to what I saw as groundbreaking work in relationship to womanism. That's Professor Maparyan's own scholarship in that area. And I'd like to think I also gained what I would describe as a kind, wise, and loving friendship. And in a way that stopped me from being just a groupie, somehow. But really, I mean, I could go on about that, but I think you really are here to hear more about Professor Maparyan. As we advertised, Professor Maparyan is the executive director at the Wellesley Centers for Women in Wellesley College. The centers have been established since 1974, and they are really one of the largest gender-focused research and action organizations globally. So their work is not only within the United States, but it's also international work. And at the center, most of the scholars are engaged in social science research, evaluation, the development of theory, of course publications, and as well as training programs. But what is crucial to the center is that they put the issues of women's lives at the center of their work. Women's lives, and I should also say, and concerns. Before joining the center, Professor Maparyan was Associate Professor of Women's Studies and also Associated Faculty of the Department of African American Studies at Georgia State University. Hence, this is the point where I entered in, right? But also very much the founding co-director of the Women's Studies Consortium. And within this, various scholars were able to contribute to womanism as a field, theory, a way of being, I suppose, an activism, and so on and so forth. And out of this initiative also came out the journal, The Womanist. But beyond that, Professor Maparyan has also been central in other journals, so Feminist Studies, for example, Psychology of Women Quarterly, and the Journal of African American Studies. And you also find on the website that when we introduced or advertised this talk, we had mentioned that Professor Maparyan's scholar activist work interweaves threads from social sciences and critical theory. But really what she's best known for is her scholarship in womanism. And this can be described as a philosophy that women's day-to-day experiences can help them solve broader social problems. And we'll get to hear a lot more about that. Besides the Womanist Reader that I mentioned, also an important text was the Womanist Idea that came out in 2012, which really delineates the field as it is growing to become, or as it is still becoming, one might say. But beyond that, Professor Maparyan has published significantly in the areas of adolescent development, social identities, Black LGBTQ studies, hip-hop studies, and also the history of psychology. So I could really continue listing all your accolades, but we'll probably not have a presentation if I did. So at this point, I really want to thank you for what you're about to share with us in relationship to the topic of womanism.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very delighted to be here today. Not only to see my friend of many years that I've just run into internationally here and there every now and then, but also to meet with you at the Institute for Development Studies, where you're doing work that is really exciting to me. And it's an opportunity for me to begin what I think is a conversation around what is a new topic for me. But like Professor Amuadari, I would like to thank the embassy for giving me the opportunity to be here and to see so many parts of Germany on my first visit. And I would also like to thank Professor Anna Harnage for having me here. It's wonderful to be here. I know that we have a short time together, and I want to do a couple things and then leave room for our discussion. First, I want to talk some about womanism, because the first question I usually get from people is, what is womanism? A lot of people have never heard of it, or if they have heard of it, they don't know about it in depth. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the perspective itself. And then I want to do the part that I really consider experimental, and that is to think about what are the implications of womanism for development. That's a theme that I haven't really seen developed much by other scholars, but it's something that I think about a lot myself. I've not written on it yet. I haven't even really gone deeply into this investigation, but I viewed my visit here today as an opportunity to have a conversation about it with people who are working in the field and doing scholarship in the field. So that's why I'm here. And actually, I want to sort of throw the bragging back on Epifania, because her work got my gears rolling on this. The chapter that I published of hers in my first book was a chapter on how movement from traditional African architectural homesteads into urban European-style apartments affected the family lives and well-being of women from Ghana. It was a very interesting question and something I'd never really thought about before. I'd never really thought about, well, what happens when the shape of your house and your yard and the way your community interacts with your domicile space changes radically to something that's from a different culture with different assumptions about how you move in the world and how you relate with people. I've been thinking about that. I still sometimes lie thinking about her chapter and the implications. And so that got me going on, beginning to think about the implications of womanism for development, because I think that, development as we understand it today is built on a particular set of assumptions about human beings and about human goals and human endeavors and human proclivities and the nature of social groupings and so on, that womanism might frame differently. And so that's why I want to get into it. So let me start by just giving you the definition that I introduced for womanism in my first book, where my job was looking across multiple disciplines where womanism had cropped up as a viewpoint, where people hadn't necessarily defined it, but just started using it de novo. And I looked for commonalities and threads and themes across this body of work that at the time I published my book covered 13 to 15 disciplines. And so the definition I came up with is that womanism is a social change perspective rooted in Black women's and other women of color's everyday experiences and everyday methods of problem solving in everyday spaces, extended to the problem of ending all forms of oppression for all people, restoring the balance between people and the environment or nature, and reconciling human life with the spiritual dimension. Now that's a lot packed into a small space, so I want to unpack it a little bit. I think the everydayness factor really comes through, but I want to also highlight the way that womanism is thinking holistically and synergistically about three domains at once. One is the place that most people think of when we think of social change praxis, and that is human-human relationships, the relationships between individuals and groups, usually with an eye towards reducing hostility, reducing conflict, increasing peace, harmony, cooperation, and human well-being, broadly understood. We also have environmentalism that usually encompasses the relationship between humans and nature, and now we also talk in terms of sustainability as another way of thinking about that. So those realms are sometimes sort of each doing their own thing. And then we have what womanism brings in, I think, somewhat differently and newly, is this notion of the relationship between human beings and some kind of non-material realm, whether people call it spiritual, whether they call it transcendental, whether they call it invisible, whether they call it energy. There are different kinds of names that people could use. But from a womanist perspective, all three of these domains are basically an inseparable whole. And even though we can train our lens on any one to give it more emphasis, we can't solve problems in any one of those areas without solving problems in the other areas as well. And at the center of that is the agency of human beings, whether individually or collectively. That is where the locus of solution begins and gets executed and completed. Just to give you a brief, just some historical background, the term womanist was originally put into publication by poet, essayist, and activist Alice Walker, who's pictured here on the left. She coined the definition in 1979 in one of her short stories where she said a womanist is a feminist, only more common. It was a story about an African-American woman who was trying to make sense of a number of feminist writings that she was reading, but trying to apply it into her personal life. And she didn't feel as ideological as those writings were sort of implying, but she just sort of wanted to take the ideas and apply them in her everyday life. So she also had her African-American perspective, so Alice Walker called that womanist. In her later work, she offered something a little bit more like a definition, where she said a womanist is a black feminist or feminist of color. She gave a number of other attributes in a 4-paragraph definition that was written very poetically that other scholars then took up beginning in the early to mid 1980s and began applying this concept at first rather impressionistically, but then developing scholarly bodies of work that incorporate womanism. The second figure in the middle is a Nigerian literary theorist and critic by the name of Chikwenye Okonjo-Ogunyemi, who wrote extensively on Nigerian women's novels and the attributes of their worldview and their social change perspective. She pulled heavily from not only Nigerian political conditions facing women and personal conditions, but she also pulled heavily from Yoruba and Igbo spirituality to offer some ideas about how women incorporate that spirituality into their everyday work in terms of problem solving and changing things in the world around them. The third scholar is Clenora Hudson Weems, who is an Africana studies professor who has historically taken a pan-Africanist view, and she wanted to provide a different frame for viewing African-American historical figures like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and people on those lines, who she said were not acting strictly as feminists, but also from their African-Americanness, and she coined the term Africana womanism to refer to that. So I just want you to be aware that this is where it got its start, basically in the late 70s and early to mid 1980s, and from there other scholars have used the work of these scholars both individually and interpolating it across perspectives. In my own work, it's been a quest to understand what is the architecture of womanism internally, because some people for a while, particularly in women's studies, were arguing that womanism was just a version of feminism, that it was just identical with black feminism. But my cognitive itch was that they were not actually identical, that there was something deep and different about them, and I was just on a quest to figure out what it is. And so in my works, that's been my ongoing quest, and so I'm going to share some of what the conclusions I've come to with you. So a lot of people usually, after saying what is womanism, the next question is what's the relationship between womanism and feminism, because feminism is that much more familiar. And even though feminism is obviously a hugely diverse body of thought at this point in time, I think that we can still talk about some fundamental differences and similarities or relationships between womanism and feminism. I argue that womanism and feminism are qualitatively different because they're based on different cosmological and cultural foundations. So I will return to that theme. I do argue against the notion that womanism is a version of feminism. I argue that it is not a version, it is a different kind of perspective. However, I do also argue that from a social and ecological problem-solving perspective, womanism and feminism are complementary, with each contributing in different ways to well-being, peace, and justice, as well as all those other social ends that feminists and womanists work for. So it's important because sometimes in the competing arena of theories and social change methodologies, we operate from this understanding that one theory or one methodology is going to overwrite all the others because it's the perfect one. That's inherently an anti-womanist perspective, because from a womanist perspective, many methodologies contribute to the ultimate end, and being in dialogue with each other is what's important, not one overriding the other, and so on. So let me say a little bit more about what I view as the distinct cultural and cosmological foundational differences between feminism and womanism. I think that the reason that I would say womanism is not a version of feminism is because womanism emanates from African and indigenous cosmological foundations. And by cosmological, I mean understandings about what exists, how it came into being. What are the fundamental categories of existence, including humanness, including earth, creation, etc., including the spiritual world. What exists, how are those things interrelated, how do they interact, and how do we understand what we're trying to do when things evolve and move in a direction. And so from that worldview, I think that there are some common features. Again, there are great diversities across African and other indigenous cosmologies. However, some things that we are more likely to see are an emphasis on some kind of spiritual realm, and also an emphasis on the vitalistic universe, the idea that the universe is alive, that it is replete with energies interacting that often have life in some kind of higher level, not a neutral kind of level, and that there is both a visible world and an invisible world, or multiple invisible worlds, and that they interact, and that relationship is not non-significant. So there's an assumption in those worldviews that that's reality. There's nothing really to question about that. There's also more emphasis on the collective and common will. So when people are thinking about what's right, what's just, what's best, and so on, there's a sense that the individual is important and the collective is important. The collective may be the family, maybe the village, maybe the city, maybe the nation, maybe all humanity. But the idea is that collective well-being and individual well-being have to synchronize. They can't be juxtaposed, or they have to be thought of simultaneously. There's also an emphasis on wisdom, which is learned life experience as well as experience that comes from, to some extent, one's relationship to the spiritual. And that kind of understanding about how one knows things is contrasted to the notion that pure reason is the ideal way or the only way to know things. The reason is not dislodged, but at the same time there's understandings about knowing in different kinds of ways that are also valued and considered productive in the social change arena. There's also, from this cosmological viewpoint, an ecological understanding. On the one hand, that means that everything in the natural world, not really pulling humans out as non-natural, but understanding even the things that aren't human in nature are equally important, that humans are embedded in a natural matrix that is important in its own right. And also that there's a dialogical viewpoint, that all things, starting with all people, interact with each other in a conversational way where they build knowledge, they build experience, they build various kinds of things together through an interactive process that is not strictly linear. There's also a synthetic kind of understanding about things. Now, if we're moving more into contemporary times, Womanism has a historical connection to decolonial histories, because the women who began talking about the womanist viewpoint, often in their own activist histories, had been involved in decolonial activity, and often they found themselves at the intersections of multiple movements. Movements for example, third world liberation, movements for feminism, movements for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender liberation, movements for class relations, forms of liberation, and so on. And so their perspective was that all forms of liberation at once should be worked towards, and that achieving all those forms was important simultaneously. And so that very integrative kind of understanding really permeates womanism as an idea. Last but not least, womanism, from this perspective, also has an integrative and invitational methodology. This idea that when you're trying to solve problems, it is not the preferred method to draw a line in the sand and say, well, we're on this side and you're on this side, and we're just going to hash it out until one of us is the winner. It's more the idea of, okay, we've got a problem here, let's all come to the table, let's all come in the Palava hut, discuss it together, figure out a way that we can workably do through that dialogic process. And so that is in contrast to some of the more, I would say more widely circulating ideas about how to make social change that have an oppositional quality. This definite idea about these guys are not okay, these guys are okay, and anything we work out has to either get rid of these guys or overwrite what they're doing. The womanist understanding is much more of a, sort of uses a family metaphor, the idea that people, even when they disagree horribly, are somehow always connected and must return to that in the end. And so those kinds of beliefs underwrite the womanist perspective, or the womanist idea, as I call it in my second book. I'm sure that as I've been talking, you've probably been reading the things on the feminism side, so I won't go through them in as much depth and detail. But I think that there, even though feminism has many diverse sort of subtypes and sub-theories, that they have historically come out of a European Enlightenment foundation in a sense with a focus on individual rights and individual liberties and ideas about human rights that come out of that. They've been largely secular, except for some forms of cultural feminism that did have a women's spirituality component. That there's been a little bit more focus on individualism than the collective, although that's not always true. There is definitely recourse to reason, and there is more of a nomothetic or universalist kind of orientation that the grand women's narrative has some kind of universal quality. I think that most strongly occurred, for example, in the 1970s with the sort of sisterhood is powerful, sisterhood is global kind of thing, but then we saw that spawned many responses say, well, my women's experience may be different from yours and so on. But there's also a link to colonial history to some extent, because many authors have written and argued about how a Western version or a European or white-based version of feminism has been brought in an imposing manner into cultural arenas where that would have not been the women's movement that would have arisen autonomously, and that is sometimes perceived as colonizing in nature. So that's just to give you a little bit of an understanding of what I mean when I say that they are culturally, cosmologically different. Again, though, I return to the fact that both sets of strategies are needed, valuable, and important. So the idea is that they will coordinate. However, my focus has been on womanism because my quest has been to learn more about it, figure out what it is, and add to how it's understood. So just to give kind of a rehash womanist worldview, because I argue in one book that womanism isn't really a theory, it's more of a worldview, it's more of a way of being in the world, it's more of a spirit. But the attributes are that it's culturally rooted, and not just in African and indigenous cultures per se, but as Clara Hudson Weeks has argued, for any person, they have ancestral roots going back beyond this period that we're in now, where there is wisdom to be gained to bring forward, to share with the rest of humanity that can be in the spirit of womanism. It also has a spiritual dimension, ecological. It's eclectic in the sense that it pulls from many sources, and it's good at bringing diverse elements into some kind of harmonious working whole. And it's holistic in the sense that it understands all these parts are always in relation to each other. It synthesizes them. It's very pragmatic, returning to the everyday. There's a desire to get real problems solved, not just to talk about things, but to make sure that everyday people have better lives as a result of the things that we do. It's invitational in the sense that even when people disagree, or even when the parts, the stakeholders in a decision-making situation are quite diverse, that everyone should be invited to a common table where they have equality in the conversation, in the sense that everyone is able to weigh in from their standpoint, from their place in the world. And then there's also a visionary or teleological element to womanism in the sense that there is an idea that not only can we create the world from our visions of the world, but also that we are ultimately good beings and are being pulled towards higher and better versions of ourselves. I think that there's an implicit belief in the goodness of human nature. Womanist methodology in terms of how it solves problems, there's a notion that for lasting social and ecological change to take place, there need to be a variety of things that happen. One is that inner change and outer change have to be complementary. Outer change is like changing social institutions, changing the environment, changing the infrastructure out in the world. The inner change is changing the thoughts, the attitudes, the emotions of people. Because the idea is, for example, if you change a law and people don't really want to do the new thing, they'll undermine it. However, if you have an intervention that both changes the law and helps people to have different emotions about things or different attitudes about things, then the two will converge and there will be sustainability of that change. In fact, some of my own past research related to the impact of the Brown versus Board of Education school desegregation Supreme Court case is a case in point, you know, where you can see in American society it took a lot, and we're still working on getting people's attitudes and emotions in line with the justice standard that we set up through the desegregation law. We also, to have this lasting and sustainable change, need to have human and environmental domains or ecological domains thought of simultaneously, and also visible and invisible factors. Again, I could do another complete lecture on what is meant by invisible factors from a womanist perspective, but for now I will assume that everyone in the room can come up sort of with their own version of what that might mean. And then last but not least, the emphasis on the everyday as a site of action. in the talk that I've been doing about reconciliation, I've been giving a lot of examples and stories about people who made important social change using methods or relationships or interactions that happen in the course of their everyday life, not big institutional types of efforts, but things that had an institutional impact through the ripple effect. So the everyday is often not a highly politicized site, but for Womanists, it is the place where, first of all, the hearts and minds work takes place, and second of all, where all of the social ills that we have ultimately play out. It's because people suffer in their everyday lives that we even have these big social movements and institutional issues to start with. All right, so now I want to shift into just sort of an imagining about womanism and development. And I'll assume that if you have questions about womanism, maybe we can hold them till the end. But if you know, does anybody have anything about womanism per se that you just need to know before we move on? Good, all right. So development also is obviously a very diverse field that's meant different things to different people at different times. And there are many versions of what it means. This is just a smattering of ideas. Obviously, one of the ideas at one point in time was an idea about industrialization and modernization and sort of making parts of the world that weren't like the West, more like the West, particularly the United States. Also, you know, there's some idea that it means helping people to achieve material prosperity so that the material prosperity of the world is more evened out or more people have access to material prosperity. There's notions about promoting economic growth and rather than putting the focus on individual people's lives on the national economy level and thinking about what kinds of individual level factors feed into economic growth at the national level, things like health, education, working conditions, policies, market conditions, and so on. We also can talk about development in terms of the reduction of poverty and inequality and improvements of standards of living around the world. And if we want to get a little more philosophical, we can think about it in terms of increasing people's choices, their capabilities, their freedoms on a global scale. I just offered these just to sort of situate us within a range that I'm sure you're already very familiar with so that we can begin to have a conversation. I will emphasize again here that this is new thinking for me. I want to figure out what would womanism have to contribute to development discourse. And in my own thinking, I recently read a document that's not particularly new that I found kind of interesting in informing my thinking. It's called The Prosperity of Humankind. It was published actually in 1995 by the Baha'i International Community. But I think that the reason that I found this document to be informative is because it's the only other thing on development that I've seen so far that really has a kind of spiritual dimension added into the development conversation. So some of the points that I pulled from this that I found useful, the idea that material benefits and endeavors cannot be regarded as ends in themselves. Their value consists in not only in providing for humanity's basic needs, but extending the reach of human abilities. That kind of gets into that last definition we saw in the previous slide. And that prosperity, which is sometimes another word for the economic growth or material well-being, should be defined as an awakening to the possibilities of spiritual and material well-being. Also, because the relationship between the individual and society is a reciprocal one, the transformation has to occur simultaneously within human consciousness or mind, heart, attitudes, as well as the structure of social institutions. Important in this perspective is the immense wealth of cultural diversity achieved over thousands of years, the understanding that it's vital to the social economic development of the human race. And last, that human beings are impelled to express their immense capacities latent within them through productive work designed to meet their own needs and the needs of others. I think as I was reading this document, you know, I said there's a certain kind of view on human nature and human possibility that is implicit within this document, and it's similar to what I perceive as being at the heart of womanist ideas about development, because it does cause sort of a getting back to the philosophical question of what are we assuming about human beings when we engage in development work? What are we assuming about how they will behave, how they will think, how they will feel, what they will want, what they will do, what kinds of strategies will work, what ends are we working towards? All those things spin off of what we assume about human beings. So in terms of pulling from womanist principles and thinking about which ones might be relative or informative to a development discussion, this is one set that I came up with. First, that human, ecological, and spiritual aspects of life would need to be considered simultaneously. I think we definitely have gotten to a point where we're considering the first two together. The third one is more challenging because people don't agree about spirituality, and we view that as an impediment to including that as a dimension. But as I said in my talk last night, an assumption of spirituality, which we could language a number of different ways, doesn't imply religiosity. There's a difference between spirituality and religiosity, and I'm not talking about religiosity here. I'm talking about something that acknowledges an invisible dimension to life, an energetic dimension of life that has material implications that can be understood in a lawful way. Also, the womanist perspective would imply that African and indigenous cultural perspectives more broadly would need to be better reflected in the shape of development discourse and solutions. I think that there is, particularly in the process we've observed, for example, with the conversations about the Sustainable Development Goals and things of that nature, that there has been more attempt at inclusion and equalization of stakeholders in discussions. But I think many would also argue that we're not there yet in terms of equality of influence and equality of participation, and that particularly some of the kinds of populations or groups that womanists would be concerned with are still not really at the table. So womanism would advocate for that. Also, people and stakeholders from all cultures would need to be at the table as equal voices and partners with a highly participatory kitchen table model of problem solving. And I use that phrase kitchen table because womanists often use it to describe a mode of conversation in which people from diverse places come to the table at different points in time, and everyone is able to contribute to the conversation from where they are with relative equality. Also, this womanist perspective would imply that development targets would need to be at once human, ecological, and spiritual, not just material. So the things that we're working on would not just be material things, they would also be environmental things and human things, spiritual things, because they all work together to complete the work of development. Next, physical, emotional, cognitive, relational, ecological, and spiritual impacts of development actions and processes would need to be actively considered at all times. Thinking about the effects, many of these kinds of effects we already think about. I mean, we already think about physical and ecological effects in development work. We probably think less about emotional impacts. We may think a little about cognitive. We don't think at all about spiritual. So I think that the womanists would advise that we would include all of these categories in our consideration of the impacts of development actions and processes. And then last, the notion that sacredness would underpin our working understandings of human value and ecological integrity comes from the womanist notion that human beings are sacred, that creation is sacred, and that when we invoke sacredness as a construct, we actually invite or evoke people to treat each other, themselves, and the environment with sort of reverence, awe, more positive kinds of interaction. So womanism would push us to have a kind of view of human nature that would bring that kind of expectation or even invite that kind of expectation into the process. All right, so as I think about different versions of what development means from some of these different sources that I've just gone over very quickly, I see that there are sort of four implied equations about what development means. One is that development is really just a direct line to material advancement and economic growth. Sort of on the other end of the spectrum would be this idea that development is this direct line to human well-being, sort of understood in a less material way. And then the third one is that if human well-being is the outcome, that the development, the way to human well-being is through economic growth or through material advancement. And then the last one is sort of this idea that human well-being is achieved from development when economic growth and advancing human consciousness, and by that I mean broadly things like culture, rights, justice, and spirituality, is advanced simultaneously in both things. And so, you know, each of these has its merits in terms of understanding development work, but it was clarifying for me just to think about, you know, which one of these models are we working with at any given time, what are the implications of that, and do we want to shift the kinds of equation that we're working with when we're talking about development. All right, so I've gone past 30 minutes at this point, and I think what I want to do, I just want to move to the conversation, but I did put some examples of organizations that I'm very impressed with. I'll just briefly mention them, even though I won't talk about them much. One is African Rural University, which I view as an example of womanist development in action. It's an all-women's college in Uganda that uses a visioning process. It teaches women to be development workers in their local communities. It draws them from the local communities. It gives them resources about development. They also have this, in their curriculum, this unique visioning process where they have people go back out to the communities and say, what future do you envision? What do you want to achieve? And they use that to build up, to have the community build up their own development. Another one I learned about more recently is We Are the Solution, Celebrating Family Farming in Africa, which is one of the initiatives of Fahamu, based in Nairobi with offices all over Africa and England. But it's a sort of a food sovereignty movement that is bringing women farmers together to help make food solutions in their regions. And I think that the idea of bringing women farmers, who are often people who are hard to involve in development conversations, is something that this organization is doing well. And the last one is the Pearl Community Empowerment Foundation, which is also in Uganda, which is taking a very holistic approach to the education of I should say, educationally talented rural Ugandan girls by not only finding ways and sponsorship to get them in school, but having community projects that involve the parents. The lower picture there is the building of a library that's going to serve multiple schools and multiple communities, villages in the region where it's being built. It's being built brick by brick by people from those communities. And so it's a very collaborative kind of effort that I think shows the holistic kind of approach that womanism tends to recommend. So I think rather than giving all this summary, I'm just going to stop now and let us go ahead and get into questions, conversation, and discussion. So thank you.
So start with any questions that would you like to take them one at a time, or would you like to take them one at a time?
Yeah, that's fine. If people have questions now, we can start that way. And if they tend to be a lot, we can condense them.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation and inspiring one. In feminism, gender relations are one of the foci. What is your or the approach of feminism on gender relations? I mean, you mentioned it by this kind of invitation back to the common and whatever, but do you have a different perspective on, let's say, gender relations? Because exactly that is something that feminism wants to change.
That's right. That's a very good question, and it's one with a slightly complicated answer, but I'll offer some different pieces of information. First thing to point out is that even though womanism is called womanism, it's not an all-women thing. It's definitely open to people who feel resonance with those kinds of perspectives that women, Africana women and other women of color around the world have brought forward as a result of their cultural and historical experience. In terms of gender relations themselves, I think that there is still that sort of idea that women and men, or people of all genders, are inherently connected. And when there is any kind of tension or conflict, it has to be worked out through dialogue with the understanding that they will return to a harmonious relation. But in some African cultures and in some other indigenous societies as well, there's also sort of a diarchic notion about women and men, that they each have their own power and they're each sort of cosmological counterweights to each other. And so that provides a different kind of understanding about women in relation to men and some different fodder for problem solving. It doesn't have the necessarily men up, women down kind of thing, but it's like men and women are on the same plane. They may get into fights, but they both carry important power that if the community doesn't have access to both, the community will suffer. So I think that is a notably different kind of understanding about gender relations. And I would also say, just if there's a question about transgender people that sometimes people raise after I mentioned diarchy, that womanism has also expressed openness to people of all genders, with understanding that everyone is interconnected through their way of being in the world to everyone else.
I have two questions, if I may.
Sure.
First of all, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I had not heard about womanism before, so it was very interesting for me. The first question is, is there a difference how womanism as a worldview regards research, or how do you as a womanist researcher regard your position as a scientist in the scientific community?
Right.
And the second question would be, as womanism has a lot of pre-assumptions or a lot of different worldviews, wouldn't it make sense also as a woman, from a womanist perspective, to rethink the development, the word development, profoundly, and before saying a womanist perspective on development, seeing what are the alternatives to this word, to this word development?
All right, those are both very good questions. Okay, so the first question, remind me again. Science, researcher. Okay, so the answer to that is that womanism would view research in a very multimodal way. Obviously, we have the scientific method, which is sort of our classic go-to in academia in terms of how to do research. And then there have been within academia, various kinds of critiques about that scientific method, about research, particularly between quantitative and qualitative methodologies and so on. Womanism would be for a diversity of methods of yielding and testing knowledge. And so the idea that the scientific method is one viable method, but there might be other kinds of methods that people would use. For example, people who have studied deeply in various kinds of spiritual and metaphysical disciplines also have other ways of getting and testing knowledge. So they would say, okay, let's put the two in connection. Also, people learn from lived experience. People have firsthand experiences that may or may not reflect what the scientific method has yielded in terms of information. So the idea would be, well, that also should be brought into the conversation. So the idea is, it's almost like a broader form of triangulation. This idea that we should always have multiple, multimodal pathways moving us towards knowledge, moving us towards the testing of assumptions, the evaluation of things that we do, and so on. So that would be multimodal. All right, so your second question was, might we just sort of move around the concept of development altogether and come up with something completely different, et cetera? I think that's actually a really great question, because when I was thinking about putting this talk together, I was thinking about all the people in the world who feel like, we're just fine, we don't need development, we're real happy with what we're doing. And so, yes, we do need to make room for the idea that development as a concept has some artificiality to it. It is not universally embraced and accepted. And I think womanism would start very much from ask the people how they feel, what they want, what problems, that's why I love the African Rural University model. Go into the community and say, what problems do you want to solve? How do you want to solve them? And what other inputs might you like to help you figure that out? Rather than, guess what, I see a problem you have, I have a solution for you, let's do it. I think that it really is that dialogic part of womanism would inherently predispose something other than perhaps pure development perspective. However, I think the other thing about womanism is it's practical. So it's like, if the world's having a giant development conversation, you're going to jump in and then you're going to mix it up on the inside. More, some people might say, oh, well, we've got this other thing, it's not called development, we want to share it with you, but it's not stay outside the conversation, it's get in the conversation, bring more people in the conversation, let more people shape what's happening. Thanks.
Just thanks for the very interesting presentation. It's a very simple question, but if there's womanism, is there manism as well? And if
I've never heard of it. I don't know, the joke that womanists have is sort of that they might have taken humanism, but humanism was already taken and it was mostly for men. So, womanism, the title may be deceiving in the sense that, women came up with it maybe, but it's not meant to be just for women. Men, I've never heard of anything called menism. People say menism already exists. Everything we already do is already menism, So womanism is sort of a contrastive, but a contrastive that is not attempting to create a new opposition. It's a contrastive that's just trying to create another point of conversation or a point of invitation to think in some other ways. So yeah, that's a good question.
I just noticed that you mentioned very often the concept of spirituality. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What the role plays in womanism, and,
yes,
and whether it is really kind of a shared concept?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. Let me start from a very simple, practical place. If you go around the world and you ask most people, statistics show most people consider themselves religious or think the spiritual world exists. That's a majority of the world's people. So from a womanist perspective, starting from a place where people already are is a good starting point. Second of all, womanism is very, well, let me start second place. Many womanist scholars themselves have had very sort of diverse, winding spiritual pathways where they have studied or belonged to or participated in multiple traditions. So there's this kind of ethos within womanism that many, many traditions and thought systems have something valuable to contribute, and that the quest or the process of investigating what's there and bringing those many good ideas to the table is a good process. And so when there's a talk about spirituality, there's this idea that there are many, many pathways that humans have created over time for investigating those questions. And the idea, again, is not to make one sort of dominate all the others, but the idea is to be aware of how many interesting, informative pathways or bodies of knowledge that there are, and encourage people more to share those. And so the idea is that, okay, if we are going to have the assumption that some kind of non-visible, important world, universe, realm, whatever you want to call it, exists, then we then turn to the systems of thought and practice that human beings have variously come up with across cultures and around the world to think about that relationship, and we bring it into our problem-solving corpus. That's the idea. So I couldn't talk about spirituality per se without invoking many, many traditions and bodies of knowledge about that. If this were another talk, I could probably talk about many of those, but I'm sure that everyone in this room is aware of many of them. What I think is different about womanism, though, is particularly the political perspective or a social change perspective, is that there's a strong belief that the information gained from those systems of thought gives us new tools for social change. I'll just give one small example. And it falls under something I talk about in my book as sort of either applied spirituality or applied metaphysics or applied mysticism. There's this, ideas about how energy circulates. And when I say when they say, what do you mean by energy? Well, I just say, well, if you have thoughts, that's energy. You can't see them, but they obviously have effect in the world. Emotions, do you love anybody? Well, if you do, that's invisible, but it's energy. And those aren't the only kinds, but they make it an accessible concept. So the idea is when we are doing things to deploy energy towards particular ends, then we are applying our knowledge about the invisible world to ends. So for example, if you want to decrease hostilities between people, then you try to bring some other energy than hostility into the process and into the room and into the interaction. And so that is an energy interaction pulling from the invisible world. And there are a lot of kinds of treatises, philosophical, spiritual, religious, etc., that have ideas about how to do those kinds of things. And so womanists would argue we would get more bang for our buck in our social change work if we considered the energy dynamics and pooled ideas about what we can do with those energy dynamics to advance our political, economic, social, etc. ends. So.
I think what you call a womanist perspective leads up to a holistic perspective. And if you would call that instead of womanist perspective, maybe more people would feel invited. Because I think it's rather misleading. We very, very easily think of feminist perspective, then comes up all the problems, and all the disrespect, etc. So,
right.
I suppose you call it a holistic aspect towards development.
I mean, that's an interesting perspective, and I would say two things about it. The first one is, I didn't invent the word womanist, but I've been following it as an intellectual thread. So I continue with that as part of my intellectual project. But in terms of the naming, I often make the case, and I feel this very strongly, that the ideas are more important than the name. And that in certain contexts, it's important to share the ideas and not necessarily even invoke the name. Because the reason that the name has been important is it has helped us to see a system of organization in a field of thought and activity that previously had not been understood as a system. So having something to hang on and say, wow, here's a whole system of things going on that before we weren't registering as a system of things going on, I think that womanist scholarship has helped us do that. But holism is one of the strongest attributes of it. However, holism is used in so many different ways that if it were simply called a holistic perspective, it could easily get sort of absorbed into the many, many discourses about holism that exist. But it isn't an easy conundrum to solve, because it's true that some people are very turned off by labels, and some people won't attract to something that is a labeled point of view. Other people value the label because they feel better when they have a label to raise their flag around. You know, the truth is the world is filled with a diversity of people, and both of those types of people have to be accommodated. And as I've said so many times, what I care about is that the things that are horrible about our world, that we all agree are horrible, that we move towards ending them. Whatever gets us there is great with me, whether it's womanism, holism, nothingism, silencism, feminism, you know, whatever it is, let's all work together to make that happen. So these kind of conversations are really important, but I think what's important for me about womanist scholarship is that it just is illuminating a different path and a different set of understandings about human beings that give us some additional points of discussion and some additional possibilities for doing this work that many of us are trying to do in different ways.
So may I add something?
Sure.
I think I agree with you that most women think more holistic than most men. Let's put it like this. And yeah, I mean, I see the relationship between womanism and the holistic view. And yeah, I didn't thank you for your lecture, but I would like to thank you so much.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And I also want to throw in that, you know, a question we have to ask is like, maybe women are more holistic. Why that is, it could be that we've been socialized in ways that cause us to be that way. It could be there's some natural thing. I'm not trying to decide that debate, that's not my focus. But my follow-up question would be, if that is a useful and helpful way of viewing the world or way of doing things, can we get more people interested in that? Men, boys, etc. And even in the other talk I mentioned briefly about the power of things like childbearing and education to help people get ideas about how to be in the world. And that's an opportunity to help people see things more holistically. So it's something that it's important everyone has access to ideas like holism. So thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to ask you whether you could probably elaborate a little more about where you place inequality and positionality, because, I mean, for instance, I mean, right now, as you probably know, there's a wide-ranging debate on white privilege, or Emma Thompson addressing the UN post-Ferguson, and perhaps I'm just also coming from this perspective of, well, feminism and the battling metaphor, which, of course, is not very much of a trope here. But, I mean, how do you reconcile the two forces, particularly when you're looking at these widespread injustices, Blackwater, just the big macro issues?
Right, and the two forces you're referring to as?
Dialogic communication,
right,
for instance,
okay.
like in a Senate sort of
Yeah.
sense.
Right, okay. So I think, first of all, I'll say that womanism is inherently a perspective that has the intention of moving people towards greater equality, that existential equality is foundational to womanist thought and perspective and to the intentions of the actions that womanists engage in. I think, though, that the question that often comes up is, do womanist methodologies help with reducing inequality in the world when inequality is playing out in such giant impersonal ways in the world at this point in time? And my argument is that it does help in some specific ways in concert with other forms of action. My argument about, you know, the dialectical model is that, you know, if you always have forces in opposition, then you don't have an ability to really achieve through that method an integrated endpoint. It just is a repeated cycle of conflict. And I think that the womanist imaginary is quite different from that. Doesn't want to stay locked in that. And so I think that the approach that womanists offer is not to say that those other methodologies are not useful to deal, you know, with the struggle kind of paradigm, but that there has to be some very concerted activism and social movement praxis around changing how people think and feel. I mean, it sounds like a Hallmark card, but it's really not. Because, you know, if we think about, for example, eradicating violence in the world, whether it's domestic violence in the home, or whether it's terrorism, or whether it's war or state-based violence, violence is only going to occur when people have violent impulses and when people support the production of violence in society. And most people, myself included, can go inside myself and look at where there are seeds of violence still within myself and ways that I support the production of that process. So womanism would say, let's make a strategy that people can use for doing that internal work so that we are collectively routing out violent impulses, and we're also doing the kinds of external work that help minimize the things that get people in a violent mindset. So for example, if I don't have enough food to eat, if I'm in pain, if my neighborhood's horrible, if everybody in the world seems to have better things than me and I have no way of getting to them, I'm going to be mad all the time, I'm going to feel horrible. You know, womanism says, let's take care of that basic stuff. You know, that basic stuff changes the psychology of how these larger structural things play out, the processes by which they come into being and continue to be reinforced and reified. So womanism is saying there's this other arena of activism that isn't being paid attention to enough, and it has to do with those invisible factors of how people think and feel, and also how well people are in the world physically, socially, and so on, and says let's also work on these with intentionality and in a systematic kind of way, with a recognition that they are all productive of those other giant things that we are also trying to dismantle.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting, inspiring presentation. I was just wondering, it came to my mind, a long time ago I read more about ecofeminism from Vandana Shiva. I was just thinking there's so many similarities. Well, where do you see now the difference between the ecofeminism side from, basically, let's say, Asia or generally Vandana Shiva and womanism? Yeah, I think ecofeminism has made great strides in bringing that integrated kind of holistic perspective, particularly in feminism. And I would say that even within ecofeminism, there's a range, particularly in terms of the inclusion of variables like spirituality, because some versions of ecofeminism have that as part of the work and others don't, so there's that spectrum. But again, I will return to my point that the language is in some respects secondary. So if I read a text, a good example would be someone like bell hooks. A lot of times bell hooks writes things that I would say, oh, that sounds kind of womanist. But I would never call her womanist because she herself has said, I'm not one and I don't want to be one. And so I respect that for her, that's not what it is. But for someone else, you know, I might read the work and go, oh, that sounds kind of womanist to me. And it doesn't really matter to me what people call it, but if we can find a point of agreement or convergence or harmonization of our ideas and intentions, then that's very productive for change. And so it would make me want to find ways to link those ideas together. It's never about saying, well, this really is or isn't womanist. That's not really the project. The project is who has good ideas to make things better, and how can we get all of those people working together and everybody knowing about that stuff at the same time. So yes, I see overlaps, and they're welcome overlaps. They're welcome overlaps.
Yeah, just you call the project paradigm womanism, but then you refer very much to kind of very particular experience of African and American women, or Africana as you call it. But I didn't fully understand from your presentation kind of what makes it so specific, and then how far it relates a little bit to what she just asked, how far it's different from other experiences which seem to be similar to a certain degree. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I would say that womanist origins, in terms of those scholarly progenitors who first coined the terminology and so on, place their emphasis definitely on the experience, the knowledge, and the ways of African descent women. But even in some of their own writings, particularly in Alice Walker and Clenora Hudson-Weems, they went on to talk about how other cultural experiences beyond Africana were also productive of and included within this worldview or within this point of view. And that there was an encouragement for people in general, particularly, for example, moving beyond the race binary of black and white, which is a different kind of construction than cultures. And so looking for the wealth, looking for the ideas, the genius in cultures, particularly ancestral cultures or indigenous cultures or so on, the idea that we all have places that we can look like that to help provide alternatives to our thinking that are more in line with this holistic point of view that sort of defines womanism. So I think the idea was saying, okay, we're Africana women, we're looking at ourselves first, and we're seeing what we see. And we're offering this thing out, we're saying this is a
what a social change paradigm looks like to us based on our Africana cultural, historical experience. But as we investigate other people's points of view, other people's work, other people's cultural experiences, we see resonances, we see overlaps. So it increases the reach or the embrace of the concept, but it is not doing so in an exclusive way, saying, okay, we're going to suck your point of view away from what you called it before and suck it into womanism. It's more just like, okay, there is harmony, there is similarity of viewpoint there, and so it's creating a big tent. But it's also saying, if you want to call yourself something else in the big tent, that's fine too. There's not a non sequitur, along the lines of different points of view. People can still have those other points of view. Womanists are looking for where do we connect, where are we similar, where can we be helpful to each other. That's really the best way I can answer that.
So would you like to go back please to your slide on distinct pathway?
Oh, sure.
Please, I just want to ask a question about
this one?
No, the one of distinct pathways.
Oh,
it's a type
the one with the feminism and the womanism?
Yeah,
this one? Okay, sure.
Yeah, so would you say that you can apply also this to African women, the womanism perspective here, and that would you make a difference between African American women and African women here?
I would say that some African women have defined it for themselves. So, for example, Chikyoenwe Obinyemi, she's someone who is herself an African woman who said, I'm defining African womanism, and she used it to bring specificity into her discussion about the political concerns and experiences of women in Africa. Again, her own personal cultural focus was Nigeria, Yoruba, and Igbo. But there have been other women, there have been entire volumes published on African womanism. So I don't have to apply it, others have already applied it to themselves. However, as with feminism and womanism in the United States, African womanism has not displaced African feminism or other kinds of perspectives that are named differently. It has just added a new discourse into the conversation. So yes, my answer to your question would be yes, because women themselves have already done it, and there's a search for continuities across the diaspora and then beyond to encompass the cultural diversity of the globe.
So at this point we'll probably wrap up.
Okay.
I didn't want to just sneak two comments in. One, I thought it is interesting that you had the example of the Baha'i, because I see that the spirituality that encompasses others without them losing their perspective. But the other point or question that I wanted to have was now when we see science also identifying the invisible, so looking at plants' intelligence, looking at the nothing that's the universe, then is it perhaps a good time for something like womanism, because there's already a readiness for spirituality to be part of the conversation.
Right, and that is my sense as well. I mean, I even think about the work that physicists are doing and the understandings that are happening in theoretical physics about the nature of the universe and the origins, which is sort of what we refer to as cosmology today. I do think it's timely. My experience has been in doing this work that people often come to me and say, this is what I was thinking and I didn't have the way of saying it. So I'm finding that a community is building around this point of view, and I agree with you that in part it's because of the timeliness, what science is offering us and other fields are offering us, and even the fact that we have global communication now that allows us to talk with people around the world about our distinct experiences and viewpoints. There's a better foundation forever for this kind of conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the great questions.